Howdy and assalamu alaikum, everyone. Peace be upon you all. Thank you all for joining us this evening for our virtual program, Keeping Your Mind in Mind, Self-Care in Islam. My name is Abdurrahman. I'm the Texas A&M MSA's Education Officer, and I'll be your moderator tonight, inshallah. Our guest speaker is Dr. Rania Awaad. Before I officially introduce her, though, I want to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors for facilitating this event. Firstly, I want to thank ICBCS, the main organization representing Muslims in the Bryan College Station area and long-standing partner of the MSA. I also want to thank Stanford's Muslims and Mental Health Lab, pioneering the study of mental health as it relates to Islam and Muslims. And lastly, I want to thank the Aggie Mental Health Ambassadors for co-sponsoring this program. The Aggie Mental Health Ambassadors are a leading student-run organization working to change the culture surrounding mental health. With that, I'll introduce our speaker for this evening. Dr. Rania Awaad is a practicing psychiatrist at the Stanford University School of Medicine and a clinical associate professor in the Stanford Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. She also serves as the director of the Stanford Muslims and Mental Health Lab, where she oversees multiple lines of research focused on Muslim mental health. Dr. Awaad is particularly passionate about uncovering the historical roots of mental health care in the Islamic intellectual heritage. She has been the recipient of several awards and grants for her work, and was invited by President Obama to present her work on Muslim mental health at a convening of the Department of Health. Prior to studying medicine, Dr. Awaad pursued classical Islamic studies in Damascus, Syria, and holds certification in Quran, Islamic law, and other branches of Islamic sciences. She's a senior fellow at Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research and is also a professor of Islamic law at Zaytuna College, an American Muslim liberal arts college in Berkeley, California, where she's taught for over a decade. A nationally recognized speaker, award-winning teacher, researcher, and author in both the Islamic and medical sciences, we're honored to have Dr. Awaad here with us tonight. With that, I'll turn it over to you.
Assalamu alaikum. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. MashaAllah. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for the Texas A&M MSA, and of course, all of your community partners and sponsors. And on behalf of the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab, it's wonderful to be here, inshallah, and share this evening with you, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam ajma'in. Inshallah, today what I'm going to do is kind of talk a little bit about the topic at hand, the mind over mind discussion. But I'm going to also at first here share my screen and then in hopes that we will also be able to spend some time together in Q&A towards the end. So inshallah, please do save your questions for that time, but of course, feel free to put them in the chat as they occur to you, bi'iznillah. All right, here we are. Okay, so first and foremost, when we start conversations about Muslim mental health and where all this starts, I normally like to give some resources. Hang on. There we go. Some resources related to this work. And first sharing with you a little bit about the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab and letting you know that this is a website and a resource that includes some, although soon to be updated, inshallah, but some of the lines of research we run through the lab that I direct at Stanford, and really this overall discussion on how do we come to some of the work that we're doing now related to Islam and psychology, or Islamic psychology, and mental health as it relates to Muslims. So just letting you know about the site, inshallah. And where I'd like to start the conversation first and foremost, considering that this is an MSA, sponsored event, is really starting first the discussion related to college students. And on Stanford's campus, and our Stanford students will tell you, I spend a good deal of time with them on campus, and have over the span of years just, both within my personal work, but also the work that the Khalil Center, which is an organization that some of you may be familiar with, on integrating Islamic principles and ideologies into therapy. We also have contracts that are on multiple campuses throughout the US, and Muslim therapists that go to those campuses. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about at first here is very relevant to not just Muslim college students in particular, but really what we've seen over the course of time and so many different campuses. So I'll say, first and foremost, that history of MSAs when they were created back when in the 70s and 80s, right, and in some campuses maybe even before then, but certainly thereafter. It's been through so many iterations and such evolution over time of what a Muslim college student experience is. And by and large, there are many who now feel a lot more support than they had before. I compared my days, basically, quote unquote, here I go, I sound like an auntie, right? Like my day in college compared to what's currently happening now on campus, even for my own Stanford students, just comparing and contrasting. And it's so interesting to see that there is a certain level of acceptance that hadn't been there before. But that, of course, is very much dependent on where you go to school and how many Muslims you have on campus, how strong of a voice your MSA has, and how much advocating power they have for events like this and be actual services as they relate to mental health. But the challenges seem to be pretty far across the board, essentially what many people face, regardless of the campus they're on, regardless of how many Muslims are around them, which is really reconciling their Muslim identity with all that's kind of coming their way. And by that, I mean, when you get to a college campus, this might be the first time you're away from home and might actually be the first time you're exposed to certain ideologies between the professors you're learning from and between other students that you're interacting with that you might not ever actually have experienced before. And a certain amount of sheltering that may have happened in your life previously tends to fall by the wayside, including actual experiences of Islamophobia and discrimination that some have had before going to college, but many actually haven't had until they get to college as well. This period of time is a really interesting time in a person's life of really trying to figure out, what do I believe in? What are my identities? And what am I going to take essentially from the past me down, right? What did I inherit from my family that I'm going to stand by and with? And what am I not going to? That's everything from faith, right, to outlook and worldview, including things like, what is my opinion of mental health and how much am I willing to interact with that or even consider it something that's worth, really thinking about and engaging in, especially if you had grown up in a place in which there is, quite a bit of stigma related to mental health. I know that's how I grew up. And certainly I never in my wildest dreams would have thought I would be in a place like this where I'm working in the field of mental health. When I was in college, didn't take a single psychology course because I thought, look, in Muslim studies, silly psychology, like that's just a bunch of nonsense, mashallah. And Allah definitely has a way of humbling you, alhamdulillah. But certainly in this journey of really figuring out what works with my Islamic identity and what doesn't has been a really interesting one. And I hope, inshallah, to talk about that a little bit more. But first, let's finish talking about here in terms of college students. So this age group that we talk with, essentially in psychiatry, we call this a transitional age youth, right? Which is somewhere starting from like age 18 to college and early post-college years as well, are all considered to be transitional aged youth. And when you look at the American Muslim scene, you're really finding yourself, maybe you're finding yourself having the same reactions as some of the studies we've carried out, which show that 40% of the Muslim youth in this category really feel and see themselves and describe themselves, as thriving, and some significantly less than other people of their own age group. And you have to ask, why is that? Like, what's happening there? And others who are saying that they are essentially that their sense of enjoyment and participating, regularly in activities that they enjoy and hobbies that they like is also less compared to other peers of their age group. And so, anger might be high, happiness might be low. And you think about, what does that mean for the external kind of social political structure that we find ourselves in? And if you look certainly to the last 4 years, let's say, it's been a rough go for the American Muslim community. It's been a difficult time by and large. I think there's some hope that at least some of the policies are going to change as we, take this next, turn into the new year. And a potentially new administration. Of course, we're all still saying potentially, but hopefully. But at the same time, there's really a sense here of being Muslim and having that identity at this point in time is a source of resilience for many of us, but also an identity that has been largely marginalized and discriminated against. So you guys have probably seen this, and it's shown up, of course, the FYR, the Family Youth Institute, has put out these various infographics. And if you haven't seen this before, numbers like this might kind of be different or alarming, or, and others are like, no, that kind of speaks to exactly what's happening on my campus. And it's always interesting. If we were a live audience together, I'd ask you, do these numbers seem like they're describing your campus and your MSA? I've had mixed reactions to that, depending on where I present these numbers. But I would say more often than not, people say, yeah, that actually does sound like my campus. And I think it's interesting to kind of think about why the numbers are the way they are. How do they compare to the national average of all American college students? And what is it about these numbers, if some of you find these kind of numbers high or even alarming, what is it about it? Because there's a sense there must be then a disconnect between how we think about Islam and Muslims and the protective force of this faith and how we're looking at actually everything that's happening in regular society to everybody else around us. Are we actually immune to all of it? Well, numbers like this would show us that we're not immune, right? And just merely by having Islam as a faith doesn't in and of itself, without any other work at it, suddenly protect us from the very things that affect everyone else. And I think that's probably a good place to bring in the discussion of mental health, because here, we're talking about, largely here substance abuse and premarital sex, but then there's also the discussion of what about all the other things that college students tend to really experience as well, as difficulties and challenges. So this study was something I did at Stanford in a lot of the work I was doing on campus in the last several years, and ended up categorizing the reasons why people would come to we had these like drop-in one-on-one sessions with myself and some other folks for counseling, and to just see and it was specific to the Muslim community, it was only for them, and to kind of see what exactly was happening, without kind of going into details, but just seeing what kind of issues were being brought forth. And it was so interesting to me that, of course, the biggest slice of this pie was academic. After all, it is a college campus where people are studying, and in Stanford's case, a very competitive place. But the other portions of the pie, religion and faith was the next one right up after that. So there was definitely something about the struggle and the tussle between faith and a person's identity that was very much part of the discussion and very much on the minds of those who were coming out to seek out counseling. So was family, which was the next biggest portion of this, slice of this pie. And that's not very surprising, of course, in this age group where, again, you're kind of individuating away from your family, and maybe not necessarily away, but just becoming your own individual, individuating from your family, which sometimes causes struggles and difficulties, relationships, figuring out next steps in one's career. For these last 4 years, of course, we have and continue to still, for now, have the Muslim ban in place. So that was really difficult for many of our international students. And then, of course, just all different forms of identity. And you see a very small slice of this pie are actual bona fide psychiatric conditions like depression, anxiety, trauma, and so on and so forth. They're there, but they weren't the main presenting reasons a person sought out care, college students sought out care in these counseling sessions. It was really everything else. So it kind of shows us immediately in the beginning of this discussion that when we talk about mental health and we talk about minding your mind, right, and taking care of yourself, you don't have to have a bona fide diagnosis of a mental illness or condition to seek out help. Right? It could be any one of these things. And certainly every single person in this room has 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 parts of this pie that they could probably really get some help from somebody who's a professional to talk about some of these issues with. So again, at this point, I'm going to pause here and say, by all means, use the chat box to kind of put your thoughts, your questions as you're hearing this through, because normally when I give talks like this, it's really interactive. I love to ask questions, see how this sounds compared to your campus and to your community. Is it similar to what I'm presenting? So feel free to let me know in the chat box, inshallah, as we carry on here. And so the next part of the conversation, after giving you that kind of backdrop of, the college Muslim American kind of scene, is really talking about and breaking down what exactly is mental health. When the organizers here asked me to give this talk, one of the things they asked me to speak about was, the word mental health is thrown around so much. What exactly is it? There are all these myths about what is mental health. And inshallah, part of my goal here is to actually speak to the myths and then give you some real facts, I hope. And I hope that's useful, inshallah. All right, so let's start with the first. So the first myth here essentially says that people that have mental illness, it only affects people with low IQ. And you'll find this myth in the community. People will say things like this. They'll try to insinuate that somebody that has mental health, if they have some depression or if they have some anxiety or there's something else, maybe a more serious mental illness, that somehow it has a bearing on their level of intelligence as well. And not only is that not true, right, but we have people, even with some of the most serious mental illnesses, that have done amazing work. The amount of people who have a bona fide bipolar illness, for example, that have been and continue to be leaders. Okay, let's make sure we're muted, guys. That continue to be leaders and continue to be people who make some great, just great advances in society, also have mental illnesses, right, and conditions. So here there's an example of Ellen Sachs, who's been a dean at USC's law school. And it wasn't until she got all the way to the top there of being a dean that she actually then admitted to the fact that she has schizophrenia, right, which is probably one of the most serious of the mental illnesses that you can be diagnosed with. And I really recommend her book if you're interested in reading about this more. She talks very, very, very honestly and very candid about, experiencing, full-on psychosis while trying to not just navigate law school, but going and climbing up the ladder of becoming a dean of one of the most prestigious law schools out there, right? And then there's so many discussions on people who have been like Isaac Newton and so many other names of entertainers, and scientists and people who have advanced the humanities that have had significant conditions as well, comedians, so on and so forth. We can kind of name so many different people who only now, I feel, compared to the last 10 years, certainly in the last even 5 years, you find people, entertainers, speakers, people who come out and say, I see a therapist for X, Y, or Z, or I have such and such condition, and are actually being pretty honest and open about it in a way that even in regular, open kind of general American society, even that is relatively new. So imagine our community. We have, it's less so yet in our community, but it's definitely picking up in a way that wasn't there before. How many of you have heard this? You're welcome to use your little emoji icons there on the bottom and just kind of do a raise the hand or give a thumbs up to this. How many of you have heard this myth that psychiatric conditions are just people that are crazy? How many times have you heard the word crazy attached to any time the discussion of mental illness comes up? The number of times that I've heard the word crazy used is beyond count, right? And I'm very careful, by the way, from this point forward. I've been very careful to use the word crazy to describe anything, even if I've had a difficult day, right? I'm starting to find other vocabulary than to say, oh my goodness, what a crazy day, or what a crazy thing that person said. Just being very mindful of what we're saying and how we're saying it is really a key thing here. So this myth of that a person that has a mental health condition is considered to also be crazy is, of course, just that. And we find that, in the psychiatric field, we're very much understanding that psychiatric conditions are brain disorders, just like, and a brain is an organ, just like your heart is an organ, just like your, kidneys and your, liver and all the rest of your organs that can have medical illnesses. This too is a medical illness. And it is linked to a specific organ. And in this case, it can be both genetic and potentially biological as well. And therefore, just like diabetes, where you give insulin to help and give a deficient hormone in your body, you're giving it what it needs. Same with a lot of the mental health illnesses and the medications for them. How about this one, guys? How often do you hear this? That mental illness is the result of weak iman. This, I should probably see the thumbs up sign on all of your screens. Literally, I should see like a whole flood of like thumbs up here. Okay, inshallah. I wish this was in person. It's so much easier to do this conversation in person and just be a lot more candid and kind of down to earth about it. This is so common in our community, and it's not unique to the Muslim community. Other faith communities have exactly this same concept. You talk to the Orthodox Jewish community, folks from Christian communities, they'll tell you the exact same statement, that this idea of weakness of faith, that, you know, get up off the couch already, go pray more, turn to God, you know, this is going to go away. You're just not praying enough. You're not strong enough, right? Kind of trying to categorize what actually is potentially a bona fide mental health illness to weakness of faith, or people who go as far as saying, what is this mental health thing anyway? We've never had this. You know, our grandparents never had this and their grandparents never had this. What's wrong with your generation? Pick up yourself already, right? And this whole thing, like back in my day, I had to do this, that, or the other thing, right? And it's very belittling, of course, and very problematic. And I'll tell you something. Well, that didn't look very good. It looked better in the original slide. But anyhow, what you see here is a model that I'm trying to show, at least, that explains what we call the multifactorial model of mental health, which means that there are multiple reasons why a person could actually be afflicted with a mental health condition. And sometimes it's biological, and sometimes it literally runs in your genes. Like if you were to honestly answer the questions when I do a history, right, a family history exam here, and I would say, you know, has anyone in your family experienced a mental health condition? Almost always, Muslims especially, be like, no, never had anything like that, right? And then so you sort of have to go, you know, I find as a clinician, I have to kind of go have a roundabout way of actually getting the answer. So I'll say things like, you know, was there like an uncle or like a grandmother who maybe never really got out of her bed very often, who would isolate a lot, who really, you know, and I kind of like, and you know, eventually, oh yeah, I had an aunt who really didn't, you know, and so like they start telling a story. But no, these people are diagnosed, and that's the reality, right? Because there's been such little actual interface with the mental health and psychiatric and psychological community that so many family members of ours who potentially have something, right, or have had something, never actually got diagnosed. So there's all these stories about, yeah, that person, you know, they just had this, you know, this uncle of ours, he just had these quirks. He was so clean. And he was so particular about where you put something. And when you go to his house, you know, you have to be so careful and you're walking on eggshells. And it's like, you guys, that's not normal, right? That's an actual condition, right? And but it's not diagnosed. So people don't have the language with which to speak. They just pass it off as, you know, that uncle of ours, he was just kind of a little strange, but he's normal. Is almost always the reaction that's given. And in no way am I saying your uncle wasn't normal. But what I am saying is he very likely had a condition. And that condition very well could be genetic. And it could be something that's passed down from generation to generation. And therefore, if it hits you or somebody in your family next, it's not your fault. And it's not their fault. Just like we don't go around blaming people who have type 1 diabetes as a 9-year-old because they did something wrong. We say, La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, right? SubhanAllah, that this is the test Allah has given this person in this dunya. And we don't just sit around and go, shame on you, right? We say, let's go to the doctor and let's get diagnosed and let's get the medications you need. We certainly don't shame them, and we don't try to say that this doesn't exist or make believe or kind of hide it or brush it under the rug. And in some cases, mental health conditions are actually environmental. Maybe there's nothing that actually runs in your family. Maybe it's not a biological issue, but it's what we call an environmental issue, meaning that it's something induced by the society around you. And what I mean by that is, think about somebody who, you know, earlier in the bio, it said that I'd studied in Syria, and I spent a good deal of time in Syria, mashallah, alhamdulillah, when it's beautiful, back when it was a beautiful, well put together place and an incredibly safe place, and so many blessed scholars and teachers. If we can all just take a moment and make dua for Syria, and then also a dua, of course, for all of the ummah that's suffering in all its different corners. I mean, but, you know, I think back to Syria and I think back how, subhanAllah, you know, the people I met there, you could have been in a sense of safety and security and, you know, and just well-being, and suddenly a war breaks out and you lose all of that. And everything's just torn up all around you. So imagine, right, that person, let's say in this example, may not have something genetic or biological, but in their case, there is something what we call environmental, right? Something happened in the society around them that caused the trauma they're currently experiencing. And if it hadn't happened, they may not have had the trauma that they're experiencing. And then the final part of this is spiritual. So yes, I'm not denying that there's a potential for a spiritual condition to be part of this, but it's not the only thing. And for all of us to try to pinpoint it on just Iman would be a real fallacy, right? So in saying this, you know, kind of this thinking about this multifactorial causes of potentially of mental illness. Here's the next myth. This too, I want you guys to respond. Tell me with your emoji icons, how many of you have had this one? That it must be because of Ain, it must be because of Jinn, right? And therefore, because it's from the supernatural, therefore, the way to deal with this is with a spiritual antidote, right? Ruqya, dua, prayers, Quran reading, so on and so forth. Yep, so many people have said that because so many of us have experienced this too. And so here, people ask me this question all the time, like, Dr. Rania, but are you sure there couldn't also be like some jinn possession in the story too? Like this comes up so often, right? You know, are you sure that maybe there wasn't also Ain, you know, like the evil eye given as well? And here's my answer, guys. And I say this as somebody who's trained fully as a psychiatrist, right? But also somebody who's trained in the Islamic sciences, right? So before this medicine thing and currently in today, right? I'm very much, you know, a teacher, alhamdulillah, and a continuing student as always. You never ever finish, regardless of how many ijazas you hold, of, you know, being a student of the deen and a servant of the deen. And I say this to you as somebody who holds both, that I'm not going to be the person that says these things don't exist, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to them in the Quran, right? He names al-hasad and the ain, right? And he names the jinn, and they are creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just as human beings are and just as angels are. Where the issue is whether they are the sole causes for some of the things we're experiencing. So when somebody comes to my practice and my office and says, you know, and somebody's having some serious, let's say, delusional thinking, and the family members say, this person is, you know, seeing and hearing and saying things that we can't see or hear, it must be jinn, right? And so my immediate response is, I'm not going to deny to you that there may also potentially be a jinn factor in this, but I'm not a jinn doctor. I'm not trained in jinn extractions, and it's simply not my training. But I am trained as a psychiatrist, and so therefore, if we agree to work together on this, I'm not going to prevent you from seeking out those who can figure out about the jinn piece of the story and potentially help you and your family in this piece. But that person wouldn't be me, but I'm happy to work alongside of that person. And what I can offer you is the diagnosis and the medications that I'm trained to offer you. And if it helps, and if that works, then can we agree that maybe that's actually what it is? Do you see what I'm saying? And if it's not, then by all means, right? And alongside of what I'm doing here in psychiatric treatment, seek out the people of knowledge that claim and say that they're able to also work with the supernatural in this way. But again, not my training, not a jinn doctor, guys, inshallah, right? And I find that many families here, you know, many families that I've worked with are willing to kind of deal with that, right? Now, the harder part for me actually is finding the imams who are willing to work with me, right? Who are willing to say, you know, just as I, inshallah, come from a place of humility of saying, this is not my expertise, let's bring in expertise, that the imam side would also likewise say the same thing, which is, I'll tell you what my expertise is, but I'm not a psychiatrist, and therefore, let's make also sure that you're seeking out the care of professionals in this field, right? So that discussion and negotiation is a hard one. It's one that I've worked on very hard in our local community here to try to build up, and continuing to, inshallah. I've seen successes, alhamdulillah, over time, but I very much recognize that this is a work in progress. And in some cases, and in some parts of our communities, an uphill battle. But hopefully in having more conversations like this, like very candid and very like, here guys, let's really think about what this means together, that maybe you all as another, then literally the next generation coming through, we find a different response than perhaps what your parents and grandparents, and I'm not singling anybody out, I'm talking in general, right? Just generations before us and currently, that we do better, inshallah. All right, I'm going to speak, and here you see a couple of things here about Balkhi, which I'll come to in just a bit, inshallah. But first, let's do a couple more myths, all right? This is a myth that basically says that if you have a mental illness, it can and will just go away, right? That it can and will just go away. And you can just will it away and it'll just go away, right? Over time. And my response to that is that if something is considered to be a serious mental illness, you can't just will it away. You can't just kind of do the ostrich thing or the, kind of stick your head in the sand thing and hope that by next morning it's going to be gone. The reality is, if it truly is a bona fide condition, you do need professional help in seeking this out and getting, you or your loved ones, by the way. I'm speaking here generally and saying this to you because some people here this may be applicable to, and for others, take this advice, put it in your back pocket for whenever you do need it, or for when your loved ones need it. I'll come to a slide later about the importance of how each and every one of you is actually what we call a first responder, because you have family and you have friends and you have people who one day are going to come to you way before they come to someone like me to seek out help or say, hey, I'm having trouble with this, So anyhow, this idea of, you can't just will it away. I actually have a lot to say about this idea of seeking out professional help and care, but I'll come back to that hopefully a little bit later. I just want to get through some of this here, because now I have some of the proof for all of you who are listening and have been listening intently. Thank you for that. But at the end of it are still like, okay, show us the proof, show us the evidence from the deen. What does Islam say about this, right? This is kind of the part of the conversation that I think some are waiting for. So let me tell you what Islam says, You have here a hadith of the Prophet in Sahih Bukhari, by the way, where the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells us and teaches us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has, with every illness and disease that he's created, he's also created a cure. And he sends a cure. And when I say that, people are like, what do you mean? It just like falls down from the sky? And because we're in COVID-19 era, right? And this is like a perfect example, right? Here's this novel illness, right? Novel coronavirus comes out, causes a global pandemic. Everyone's like, when is this going to be over? When are we going to find treatment and cure? When are we going to find a vaccine? You're saying the hadith says that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends down an illness, like novel coronavirus, right? He's also going to send its cure. When, where, how? Does it fall out of the sky? Well, let me tell you how and where and how. It is basically the knowledge and the work that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the gifts that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives the humans, the people that are able to do this work. This is why, especially in this moment, all those people that are working on a vaccine, all those people that are scientists and all the people that are in those labs and all those people that have worked nights on end trying to find us the vaccines. And, alhamdulillah, it sounds like they're starting to get there. But anyway, today's talk isn't necessarily about coronavirus, but it's about this kind of concept. That just like, for example, when the AIDS pandemic broke out, and when that happened, when it first happened, there was so much confusion and so much, just like now with the COVID, right? So much, people making wild accusations and so on. And there was no cure. There was no treatment. There was nothing. And until today, there's no cure, but there's actually treatments. And again, not a topic today on AIDS, but it's still a comparison that if you can make this kind of comparison in your head, that today there's enough retroviral vaccines and retroviral medications that if a person does become HIV positive, that they can stay at that stage of HIV, being HIV positive without it going into full-blown AIDS because of the advancements in medicine. This is one day, inshallah, going to happen with COVID-19 as well. And certainly with everything mental health related, it's the same here too. Now the hadith, I'm going to say this little piece too. The hadith in Arabic actually says, Tadawu ibadallah. That's how it starts. So seek out cures, O servants of Allah. And then it follows it by saying this next piece. Because for every illness Allah sends, He also sends with it its cure. And that to me is very, very pointed, especially in my field here, where I feel like, okay, these are difficult illnesses. Mental illnesses are not easy ones. And Allah has promised that He will also help and give. So basically seeking out that help from those who are professionals in this field becomes something that the hadith tells us to do. Tadawu, like seek out cures, O servants of Allah. And then you see the second hadith on the side here, where, Usama bin Shuraik asks the Prophet ﷺ, should we seek medical treatment for our illnesses? And the Prophet responds, ﷺ, yes, you should seek medical treatment because Allah the Exalted has let no disease exist without providing its cure, except for one illness, and that is age. You can't turn back the clock, guys. Sorry, that one's not going to work. Inshallah. But we can try to do everything else, right? And the very fact that we had these ayat, these ahadith, I'll show some others soon here. The fact that we had this is the very reason why there were such advancements in all of the medical sciences and in medicine, in science, in humanities. You don't have something called a golden age, which is somewhat of a misnomer, guys, because actually the reality is we continue to have golden ages in Islam all the way until the fall of the Ottoman Empire, not just a short period of Islamic history like your history of Islam classes in your colleges would like to tell you. MashaAllah, that's a different discussion for a different day. But what I'm trying to say here is you don't have people who are coming from desert societies, essentially a jahiliyyah, and suddenly, out of nowhere, they end up with cures and treatments and science and seeking out all kinds of advancements to the point that today, some of the surgical tools we use today are ones that were developed at that period of time. And that's no different for mental health, not at all. In fact, I'll show you what I mean in just a few more slides. But let's address this one because this next slide comes up very often about psychiatric drugs. It comes up it's like, okay, great, Dr. Rania, all this sounds great and fine, but if my family member has a mental health condition and it's bona fide and diagnosed and we sought out professional care and that professional is saying they need to be on medications, should we really do that? Don't these medications have side effects? Are they going to be a zombie? Right? There's all these questions that come up and they are legitimate questions and they're important questions. And the reality is, and the way I practice personally is I always try to figure out if there is a way to treat the person, particularly with therapy, if it's a mild to moderate condition and not a serious condition first, right? Before hitting the medication options. But the reality is, you guys, oops, hang on. Okay. But every medication has side effects, even the Tylenol you take when you get a headache, right? And this is why you go under the guidance of a professional who guides you on how much to take and when to take and monitors closely your side effects and what's happening and changes it. This is all if the condition you have, out of years and years and years of scientific research, shows that it actually needs medications. To me, this is no different than the person who has diabetes and the doctor says, sorry, you've reached the end of the rope here to where you need to have insulin. That's what you have to do, right? And if the psychiatrist says the same, sorry, the condition is progressed enough or it is serious enough to where it needs X, Y, or Z medication, then we shouldn't be hearing that any different than we hear when the medical doctor, which psychiatrists, of course, are also medical doctors, say that you need medications. But it's a difficult conversation, and I'm not belittling or denying that in any way. How about this one, guys? How often do you hear this? Counseling is useless. Absolutely. Yep. This is very common, especially if you try to say to somebody who just doesn't buy this whole field of mental health in the first place. But even more so, I find it's challenging even with people who've known me for a long time. Maybe they're even very close to me, and I'll say, what you're going through sounds like it would be very helpful if you speak to a counselor. Maybe their marriage is literally on the rocks. And I'm like, speak to a marriage counselor. Or maybe their kid is driving them up the wall. Okay, get an assessment and figure out what's going on. Maybe there's actually something more here. Maybe it's an attention deficit issue. And if you actually treat that, you end up helping yourself and them in the long run, especially, right? And people are like, no, that's useless, right? It's immediate. Or this whole idea from many of our cultures of we don't air our dirty laundry to strangers, right? I'm sure you've heard many people say that to you as well. And that's honestly, that's how I felt too growing up. And that's exactly how I was trained as well. And here's what I'm going to say. It is actually, I have come to this conclusion that the work of therapy, especially if you integrate it with Islamic principles and you do it appropriately in accordance to Islam, using Islam's own indigenous kind of counseling methods and resiliency building parts of our faith, that this work to me is, inshallah, it counts as, prophetic work. And what I mean by that is not, miracles, and it's not like people getting divine revelation. That's not what I mean. The organization that I work with, called the Khalil Center, named themselves Khalil, which is a word that hopefully many of you recognize, as Khalil in Arabic is the companion, right? So for example here would be Sayyidina Ibrahim, who is called Khalilullah, right? The companion or close friend of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And a Khalil is not just any friend, and it's not just any companion. A Khalil is somebody who literally is a close companion who walks along the path with you and guides you along that path. That's the work I see therapists is doing, especially if they're doing it properly and in accordance to Islamic principles. They are like the Khalil of a person. And I think that this is something very much within the tradition. And you'll see that so many scholars of our Islamic history and past have actually written specifically about this, not just about the concept and importance of getting that kind of mentorship and support when needed, but also they drew out whole entire therapies, including talk therapies. And until anyone proves this earlier, there's a line of research in my lab at Stanford on the historical understandings of mental illness from the Islamic early ages, right? And until somebody else proves otherwise, we have found, likely in history, the very first talk therapists in the Muslim world, right? And the very first people who have classified and diagnosed specific mental illnesses. And in modern days, I'll go to the history in a minute because I think it's really interesting, but in the modern day, it's really important for you, when you find that counselor, to be comfortable with them. It's kind of like when you shop for your doctor, right? Or when you are, like courtship, where you're figuring out who's actually a good fit for you. This is the same thing with therapy. If it doesn't work the first time, keep at it until you find the person who is actually a good fit for you and your loved ones, right? How about this one, guys? Psychology is a Western construct, doesn't apply to us, right? It has nothing to do with Islam and Muslims. This is how I was raised. Absolutely, positively, right? So much so that when it was first suggested to me, right, because I was already teaching in the deen, I was already kind of a teacher of the deen in our community, doing a lot of work in just teaching various courses and classes and so on. And in the course of all of that, I had already started medical school, but had a completely different track of what I was planning on doing. And in teaching, the deen actually is what ended up leading me into psychiatry, because there were so many people who would come up, and I'm giving like Quran classes and fiqh classes and all these other classes. And then afterwards, when people come and ask their questions, they don't just ask a specific, like, hey, is this halal or haram? I mean, sometimes that's what they would ask, but often it would be like, here's my life story and my circumstances, and this is why it's really hard. And then I was finding myself, despite all the answers I knew how to answer from the textbook, if you will, I could not and was not equipped to answer actual counseling type questions. And nor are the majority of our imams, and nor are the majority of people you tend to go to for advice and guidance on, hey, should I do this in my life, or is this the best next thing, or something, right? They're not trained in counseling, guys. They may know halal, haram, yes, no, good, bad, right? But it's a whole different training. It's kind of like when it's like trying to take your car breaks down and you try to take it to the plumber. Like, why? Like, there's different professions and different fields of training for different things, right? SubhanAllah. Anyhow, so I realized very quickly that this was the case. And yet when it was first, suggested to me, I was like, no way. Well, why on earth would I do something like that? That doesn't make any sense for Muslims, right? So I had this internalized stigma to it, just like, you know, I'm sure many of you and many of your people you're connected to probably still do. But what's interesting, guys, is here. This is what I'm about the history that I was going to talk about, and I have to. I feel like I cannot get through and do justice to a conversation like this about what does Islam say about mental illness without talking about how our tradition was so strong and so holistic that the mind, our topic today is mind, your mind, right? That the mind was not just ignored by our Islamic scholars. Our system and our Islamic way of being, which is literally a way of life, encompasses everything, including your mental well-being, including your emotional well-being. It's not just your physical well-being, your intellectual well-being, your cognitive, right? It's not just those things. And for that reason, when you look at what happened, this is where I say the proof is in the pudding. If it was all theory, and it was all kind of scholars writing in great, beautiful books about this in theory, that wouldn't have been enough. You know, the Greeks and the Romans wrote some theory, but what you find in the Muslim world is something totally different. You find in the Muslim world that there is actually the first ever, guys, listen, the first ever psychiatric institutions in the entire world. The first ever psychiatric ward as part of a full hospital system. The first places of treatment for the mentally ill, and they are considered to be humane because all of Islamic medicine was considered to be, that was its trademark, is humane treatment of the mentally ill. Why? Because the Quran commanded it, right? And not only that, but to have, when you think about this, like how do you have in the Europe, which is at the exact same period of time in history that this is happening, the story of the Islamic Golden Ages is happening what? At the same time as the European what? Dark Ages. The exact same time of history. What was the Dark Ages? What were they categorized by? They were categorized by their jahiliyyah, right? They were categorized by a period of time where the sciences were not advanced in any way. And you have, let's take mental illness. If you had a mental illness in that period of time in European Dark Ages, you were either at worst, you were burned at the stake as a witch. And at best, you were sent over to a monastery to be treated by the priests and nuns and such because it was a spiritual, supernatural condition. So how do you have that happening in the same period of history as in the Muslim lands? You're getting a breakthrough in all of that stigma and a breakthrough in all of those advances and literally building up whole institutions of healing and treatment. And then try to tell me this wasn't something unique to Islam, something inherent inside of our Islamic faith that prompted this. Very Quranic ayat and injunctions that taught us to care for the mentally ill and taught us to seek out treatments and reminded us the hadiths that say that Allah sends down cures, so seek them out, right? And tadawu ibadallah, seek out treatments. This is what inspired that entire situation, and mental health wasn't ignored. It was part and parcel of this. So when I went back to all of this and started my own kind of line of studying, the lab actually branched out of some of my own research on this looking at the early primary manuscripts of what our scholars have said about this. I was astounded, floored, like totally taken aback, right? Because not only this whole idea of the Western construct, I was like, what Western construct? We were way ahead of the curve, way before anything Western ever came. And in fact, there is a lot of discussion and theory about how it was actually the science and humanities and development of the Muslim world that then made its way to cause the European Renaissance and Age of Enlightenment, right? It kind of spread that way. Now, the cherry on top for me is the last part of the slide here that says, how was all this funded? So if you want more proof of the pudding, it wasn't just buildings and institutions that were built. How was this funded? It was funded by our zakat system, which is so unique to the Muslim community, right? That is literally something that the Islamic governments paid out and made sure that treatment was accessible to all people that lived under its jurisdiction, Muslim and not. And not only that, by the waqf system. And then this use of the zakat to actually make sure that the Muslims were accounted for, that if they were needy in this way, they were able to seek out full support without even paying a cent or a dinar in this case, right? And not only were they not paying for it, they were actually at the end of their discharge when they left the hospital, they were given, in this case, in one hospital, 3 gold dinars, 2 of which to be able to reintegrate back into society, to start their own businesses, and 1 to be able to have their own clothing and shelter. So it's like beyond, it's like mind boggling. It's beyond just humanistic treatment and humane medicine. It's actually a fully holistic, integrated care of the mentally ill. Now, what I didn't tell you so far, and here are some of the hospitals and where they started and what ages they were in and where you find some of the psychiatric institutions. But what's really interesting to me is the care team. Who was the care team that were taking care of these people? Because that too is telling. Was it only a medicalized model of illness and treatment? Like today, if you have a mental health condition, you access the medical world for your help and support. Well, for them, yes, it was in what we today would call a hospital system, but it was actually called the Dar al-Shifa, Bimaristan, which is basically a center of well-being and treatment, right? And it was holistic in its sense. So when you look at the care team, yes, there was a physician who had the help of a nurse, but also there was the dietitian who was very careful in making sure and ensuring the kind of diet that was custom selected for each and every illness they were treating. And you had today we call this person a pharmacist, right? A pharmacologist, somebody who would compound the medications. And yes, they had medications, literally medications, right? Where they were herbs and different things put together in their pre-modern medications and given. And then you had the person who today we might call a social worker, mashallah, who literally was the person who helped that patient when they came into the hospital to be able to have what they needed while they were there during their stay. And upon their discharge, again, help them reintegrate into society. So imagine having that profession way before the profession of social work was ever created. And then you had on the care team, the religious leader. Today, we might call this the hospital chaplain, right? The person who went around and rotated, right, kind of rounded with the team in order to round on each and every patient. And then while the doctor was giving his advice and the nurse was doing his or her thing and the doctor, you know, each person was given, the religious advisor was giving what? Wa'ad, or religious advice to that person as well. This holistic kind of treatment model is like amazing how this was created and developed and very much inspired by Islam. And you don't find it anywhere else, definitely not in this period of history of the world. And you don't find it for centuries and centuries and centuries later until you get to Europe, right? Way after us. And there's a lot of question on where they got that from if it wasn't from us, right? SubhanAllah. So, you know, I want to tell you this about this Islamic history, not to bore you with a history lesson, but to tell you, for me, this was a game changer. For me, this was something that was like, okay, khalas, like I'm going to throw away all that stigma and all this internalized stigma against psychology and mental health. And I'm not going to embrace this wholesale. I'm not just going to like take this whole thing and be like, it's all good and great. No. I'm not going to go to that extreme because there's some really problematic things with psychology, but I'm also not going to throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? That there's parts of this that work and parts of it that don't. And I have to figure out what actually works with Islam and is part of our tradition. Because if our noble predecessors saw this, were inspired by Islam to create this, and this is our heritage and our legacy, then why are Muslims so at the very end of the discussion of the mental health when they should really be, according to our legacy, right, at the very forefront of this discussion? And so with that, I'll share with you a couple of more things from the Quran specifically for those who, you know, inshallah, all of this makes sense to you. But if you want to understand a little bit more about where all of this is coming from, there are so many built-in spiritual mechanisms for health and well-being and coping for Muslims, right? Everything from the reminders of being patient to the reminders that the Quran is a sense of a place where our hearts do find rest, right? Ala bi dhikrillahi tatma'innul qulub, this kind of concept. It's so incredibly important to remember that we have our own meditative, contemplative practices that are indigenous to Islam. You don't need to take a secularized meditation that was sanitized from Buddhism and make it your own meditation. Like, we have our own indigenous meditations, you guys, from Islam, right? And that's what kind of is now part of the work that I'm doing, and part of the work that kind of boggles me a little bit too, as to why, you know, mashallah, we take, sometimes I find Muslims jump on the whole, like, you know, self-care bandwagon and come on everybody, let's meditate and do yoga. And it's like, hold on. Those things are shown and proven to be effective in literature, yes, but do Muslims really need to be doing that if they have their own indigenous forms of healing and calming and coping, right? So anyhow, that's part of what I call the integrated model of care, which, you know, folks like myself that are in Islamic psychology are working on, and really showing that we have a long history of this. So a couple more slides on the history of this before we kind of break for some questions here. But I just want to show that, you know, for me, one of the main inspirations and one of the first people that I came across way back when I was still doing my training, and I pulled out all of these manuscripts that were from, you know, I think it started maybe probably 7th century, 8th century, 9th century, maybe all the way through like the 13th, 14th centuries of Islam, all these manuscripts, medical manuscripts. And I was looking through because I was like, where is the mental health discussion? And in doing this, at some point I had something like 125 books in my office. Like, you could barely like walk through the office because it was a tiny office with all these books in it. And one of the books I came across was now translated, or half the book is translated here, called Sustenance of the Body and the Soul by Abu Zayd al-Balkhi. When I came across this was way before it was translated. And I came across this booklet. It was relatively small compared to the others. And al-Balkhi starts, he's from the 9th century, and he starts off the book essentially saying, I'm writing this book, because notice it says sustenance of the body and soul. The original book is Masalih al-Abdan wal-Anfus. So it's the sustenance of the body and soul. And it's only the soul part is translated right now. But anyway, he starts off by saying, I'm writing this medical book talking about physical conditions and mental health conditions in the same book, so that people of my generation and doctors of my generation don't keep focusing on just the physical ailments, ignoring the mental health conditions. He's writing this in the 9th century, and it's like, oh my goodness, you know, Ya Balkhi, if you were still alive today, you would be just as disappointed, subhanAllah. But anyhow, here's Balkhi writing this. And for me, what was so mind-boggling is he writes what are like essentially like mini chapters. And if you're reading this, and if you have the access ability to write, like to read primary, this one actually is not complicated. Some of the other writings are very complicated Arabic. This one's fairly easy. And and the way he's writing, I was like, wait a second, as a trained psychiatrist, right? Fully trained, DSM, like, you know, this is what I do every day. I was reading this and going, oh my God, oh my God, oh my goodness, I think I see depression. Oh my goodness, I think I see phobia. Oh my goodness, I think I see obsessive compulsive disorder. When I got to the obsessive compulsive disorder piece, which he called, you know, waswasa, like we as Muslims all know this word waswasa. And he talked about how we all have waswasa, like a certain amount of whispering of shaitan, kind of like making us ask ourselves and check ourselves multiple times over if we did something or not. Then he differentiated what we called al-waswas al-qahri, right? Like really extreme waswasa. And he kind of moved it into a different category and said that all of us have regular waswasa, but that's not normal. And that level of waswasa, that needs treatment. And I said, wait, hold on. In my abnormal psychology class that I took and that anybody else would take, you're never going to find Balkhi in there, at least not yet. Inshallah, this is going to change, right? And you see what they write, you're going to find that they're talking about OCD as a modern illness discovered in the 19th century. First written about, you know, maybe brief discussion in the 16th century, but not really diagnosed and classified to the 19th century. And so, of course, I flip back to the book and go, when was this written? 9th century. What is going on here? So there's a funny backstory. Some of you may have heard me tell the story. I'll say it very briefly. I've told the story before, but it's kind of a great story where, you know, at Stanford, we had one of the forefathers of OCD in our department. And you guys are going to love this because his last name is spelled Koran. Not Muslim, okay? Just mashallah, pure coincidence. Tawfiq. Anyhow, but I went up to Dr. Karan's, you know, office, knocked on the door, here I am, a young, kind of very new, still trainee, and said, hey, Dr. Kron, I think, and mind you, this guy is like one of the forefathers of OCD in the entire country. He's still the guy who has written the main textbooks on OCD in the country. And he happened to have an office down the hall from me. And so I walk on over. I'm really like nervous to like to ask him this, but I knock on the door and I was like, I think I might have found a really early description of OCD, like really early. And he was like, no. I was like, but, and he was like, no, you don't understand. Like, I'm a history buff. I've written and read everything there is to write about OCD. And I said, yeah, I know. And he's like, no, look. And he starts pulling out like papers he wrote on the Greeks and papers he wrote on the Romans and all of this other jazz. And I'm like, no, but really, like, it's in Arabic. It's never been translated. And he goes, can you read it? And I said, yeah, that's why I'm bringing it to you. Like, that's what I'm seeing here. And at some point, I actually think I asked him, can you read Arabic? Like, he's giving me such a hard time about this thing. And alhamdulillah, like, it's just, he was very, very, nice throughout the whole conversation, but clearly he had never read this thing. And how was he going to? It's in Arabic. And so finally he said to me, okay, fine. You go translate this chapter, bring it back to me, and we'll see if it holds muster. All right. So I go off and I have this challenge now to translate this section. And so I do. And I bring it back to him. And what really struck me, guys, is this. Take a look at this. All right. You see here on one hand, Balkhi's criteria. And you see on the other hand, DSM-5, which is the current edition of the book. The DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Psychiatry that we actually diagnose, all psychiatrists use and psychologists to diagnose mental health conditions. I hope you guys can see what I'm seeing here. Like, it was so astounding to me because, of course, Balkhi is writing in the 9th century, pre-modern times, right? And the DSM, of course, was published, the latest version of it was published in 2013. And so I take this thing and I literally pull it off my shelf and I do this comparison and I write up, a similar chart to this and I walk it over to his office and I'm like, hey, take a look, mashallah. Dr. Kron at this point was like, jumping up and down, like he was so mashallah, he was just so excited, and not so much because of the whole Islam and Muslims piece that excited me, right? But for him, what excited him was that this was the very first, this could have been and maybe is the very first actual correctly classifying and correctly diagnosing and giving full symptomology of OCD by and large, and actually very accurate treatments to what today a modern trained psychiatrist can look at and go, yeah, that's what I would do too. SubhanAllah, right? And he was like, you must publish. So this, you can find this in the Journal of Affective Disorders is where this one is published. And the one we wrote on phobias is published in the Journal of Anxiety Disorders, because we wrote a similar thing up of how Balkhi was probably the first to diagnose phobias as well and come up with whole treatment mechanisms. Why am I telling you this whole backstory? Because you don't get Balkhi in a vacuum, guys. You don't get Balkhi from a society as a Muslim, right? From Muslim people that say, this is not part of us. Or waswasa simply enough to just say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, and go on with your day. Had that been the case and had that been the understanding, you wouldn't have prodigies like this, mashallah. And so the backstory is, by the way, when we came to publish this one got published really easily. When we came to the phobias, that journal, they took months and months and months to publish. And we were like, for sure, they're going to reject us. Anybody who's tried to publish in medical journals knows that's a very long, arduous process of, blinded peer review and so on. And finally, they wrote to us and they said, the claims you're making are so unorthodox that we that we had to, ask and hire historians of medicine to read what you were writing here and figure out if what you were saying was accurate. So they took months and months until they did that. And when the historians finished their review of our manuscript and wrote back, they said, this single-handedly overturns the books of the history of psychology and psychiatry, right? That's very exciting for us as Muslims. And yes, it's kind of like, yay, pat on the back, but that's not the point, mashallah, even though that's so cool. What is the point, guys, is that when I speak to the Muslim community, especially if they have any of these conditions, or even if they don't, something else, and they think about it and they go, no, this isn't for us. Western construct. My answer to them is, had it been, is it really? Do you know your own heritage and history? Well, let me tell you about Balkhi, right? And that's where the conversation goes. And very often, the tune changes. Like, what? Some of our scholars, wait, what? We had the first hospitals, and so on, and so psychiatric hospitals, and so on and so forth. And so, mashallah, it's been really a fruitful journey. It's a difficult journey. The lab, of course, would love to have even more publications and collaborations like this, but so many Muslims, myself included at first, had no idea of any of this heritage, of any of this history. So now you know why I'm so passionate about this, and why this lab is doing the work that it's doing, because you have to get to know more about your own heritage before we can cast judgment about, like, well, what does Islam have to say about this? Well, let me tell you all it has to say, and not just what it had to say, but how actual people took those teachings and it sparked and kind of ignited a whole host of not only scholarship, but that theory then became real practical institutions of healing that was all throughout the Muslim lands, as you saw. So mashallah, where I'm going to kind of finish this conversation is this piece over here. I said earlier I'd come back to this, which is the role of all of you in the room. That all of you are what we call the first responders, because after you hear a lecture like this, and now you know a little bit more about your heritage and history, that there's going to be somebody, maybe to yourself, maybe it's going to be your sibling, maybe it's going to be your best friend, maybe it's going to be an acquaintance. Somebody's going to, at some point in your life, have a condition or a reason why you go, maybe you should seek out some help and assistance, right? And you remember some of the discussion here today and know, like the pie chart here shows, like family and friends, this huge section of the pie here is you. This is one of the studies I ran early on in my research lab. Like this pie, this is all of you here, friends and family, right? And they're going to go to you before they're going to go to anybody else. And so being able to say to them, yes, this is something that you should seek out help for. Yes, this is part of our heritage, you know. And for anyone who asks, what about the imams? Because I definitely don't want to have, like, you know, poo-pooed on them here, mashallah. I'm part of that group. No, I'm not an imam, I'm a female, obviously, but I am definitely on the woman's side, an ustad, right? So like, this is my community too. These are the circles and the people and the ilm and knowledge that I, the circles in which I work in as well. And what I am saying, though, very clearly is that, yes, they are very helpful, but it would be wonderful to also train our imams to have the language with which to say, this is my lane and what I know. And beyond this, let's get you to some professional help and care. And vice versa, right? I think if we can all do that respectfully, that whole example I gave about the plumber versus the mechanic, like you don't send people to the wrong direction, right? When they need that kind of help. So in conclusion, how do you know to seek out, and for you or your family members to kind of seek out help and care when needed? It's really important to know this. If the conditions and the symptoms that you're seeing in yourself or your loved one is reaching a point where it's kind of overwhelming and it's starting to enter into the space of your ordinary daily function, that is when you or your loved one needs that support and help of a professional. Which means, like, you remember the example I gave about waswasa and how I said all of us have that kind of waswasa, all humans have some waswasa, but when it gets to a point that it's so much, it kind of like, kind of filters so much into your daily life that it limits your effectiveness and your ability and your capacity on your daily basis to do, if you're a student, to do your schoolwork, and your family, to carry out family functions, right? And so on. This is when help and support is really needed. And I really encourage you to remember that, including and especially some of the taboo subjects, which we didn't talk about today, but things like suicidal thinking, which is actually, unfortunately, one of those things we brush under the rug, but it's very much prevalent in our communities as well. And we have a whole line of suicide research in the lab as well to address this. It's drug addiction, and the list goes on and on and on. So what are my kind of final thoughts here and some recommendations for all of you before we kind of open up for some questions? It's really important to remember that your deen, this Islam, is something that actually can be very helpful and help with resiliency. Let me tell you what I mean. We ran a whole big study, the lab, the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab and Yaqeen Institute ran a study where we helped them kind of analyze data on 9,000 Muslims. That's probably the largest study we know of so far on Muslims and COVID-19. And can I tell you that the numbers are like astounding? Because we thought with all the difficulties Muslims have been facing all these last years, that for sure when COVID-19 came through, this pandemic and quarantine and so on, it would have made things even worse for so many Muslims. Well, can I tell you that by and large in the general American population, the Pew Research study put out a study back in April, soon after the pandemic started, and it found that in the general American population, people started to turn to faith and have a report a better relationship with God, 24% higher than usual. And the next group that has a higher number than that are people who attend Black churches. They're something like 50-some%, better relationship with God. The Muslim community, nearly 70%. There is something inherent in this faith of holding on, especially when things are really rough and difficult. That kind of resiliency that Islam gives us, that kind of hope, the tawakkul, right? Relying on God, tying your camel, but then relying on God. These concepts of even believing that COVID-19, this is what our studies showed, 9,000 Muslims, right? Show that the majority of Muslims, like a really high percentage, something like 80-some%, believed that COVID-19 was a test from God, not a punishment. And that was something that comes straight out of the Quran, you guys, right? That Allah tells us, right? وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ بِشَيْءٍ مِّنَ الْخَوْفِ وَالْجُوعِ وَنَقْصٍ مِّنَ الْأَمْوَالِ وَالْأَنفُسِ وَالثَّمَرَاتِ, right? We will test you, literally, we will test you, right? With something of fear and loss of wealth and crops and livestock and so on, right? It's like directly from the Quran. So this concept, these are part of our religious teachings and understandings. And because of that, Muslims in our study tended to be more resilient, actually, to big, difficult things they were going through. That is a blessing in this deen, to have that. Even people of actual faith communities can't claim to have that the way we have it. And people who don't have faith community, don't have faith altogether, imagine what COVID-19 did. It was really hard. The amount of substance abuse people turn to, right? The amount of Netflix binging people turn to. I'm very serious about that, by the way. I'm sure a study is going to come out on specifically like the correlation between Netflix binging and COVID-19. But anyway, mashallah. The point is, you know, people turn to other sources of healing and coping. And for us, alhamdulillah, you know, we have, in addition and better than, right, that is we have this connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So don't minimize spirituality and religiosity. It's actually something that's really helpful and considered to be a contributing factor to the resiliency and quality of life for so many people. And also remember that inshallah, you know, you as college students really have a major role to play here. I've seen this on Stanford's campus, on UC Berkeley's campus, all the campuses that I'm attached to and connected to. And they have made changes. They have made changes to where they have now Muslim counselors coming through, you know, in partnership with the Khalil Center and so on and so forth. And it's been really beautiful to see that kind of, okay, guys, we're going to take on this mental health story. And this is our heritage and tradition. We're going to make things better. And then this new generation, we're not going to ignore and stick our head in the sand the way maybe previous generations had. So here's just a little bit about the Khalil Center. Definitely check them out, look them up. I know I've referenced them many times. And they have a lot of educational material, a whole YouTube channel you guys can check out as well. And hopefully you find that of use to you. So that's where we'll end here. And inshallah, we'll take, you know, the next 15 minutes or so, 10, 15 minutes or so for Q&A. Thank you all. MashaAllah. Barakallah fikum.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Rania, for your presentation. Definitely informative, enlightening. Lots of, shall we say, food for thought. Let's move into the Q&A, inshallah. If any of you have any questions, please feel free to send it in the chat. You can private message me if you would like to remain anonymous. We have some pre-submitted questions, so I'm going to go ahead and read some of those. Inshallah, you can try to answer them, inshallah. So one here says, I hear the diet and gut health is linked to mental health problems. Does this mean that if we just fix our diet or take more vitamins, we can fix our mental health problems like depression? I guess you could comment on the role of diet in mental health.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. Sure thing. Here, let me go ahead and go back here. I don't know what happened to my previous slide. It's okay. Oh, there we go. So yeah, definitely there's always a connection. When we talk about holistic health and holistic well-being, everything's connected to everything else, right? MashaAllah. So kind of what Belkhi was saying too in his book, right? Like you cannot ignore the mind for the body and the body for the mind. In fact, his whole title, if you think about it, I know all of you have heard this concept of mind-body medicine. Yeah, that's Balkhi, 9th century, mashallah. But anyhow, this concept of like all things are sort of connected. So yes, the gut definitely is a place where there's a lot of inflammatory markers in the body. Not to go into too much biochemistry here and kind of, worry you guys too much about the scientific parts of this, unless of course you're interested. But definitely there are connections. In fact, the gut is the largest place in the body that has serotonin receptors. Serotonin is the neurotransmitter that is implicated in so many mental health conditions. And when a person takes a quote unquote antidepressant or an SSRI, it's a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, the theory behind it is that too much serotonin is leaking out. And so part of what this is preventing, right, the reabsorption or the reuptake of that serotonin is what that medication does. And where is it being targeted mostly? Well, the brain, but also the gut is highly implicated in this because that's where we find the most serotonin neurotransmitters. So when you think about the connection to your question to what I'm saying here, yeah, they're very much connected. And holistic well-being would say we need to work on both in order to get better, but not to the exclusion of the other.
Right, exactly. That makes sense. Jazakallah khair. So kind of a follow-up, someone says, does exercise help also? I assume you mentioned the holistic, so that falls into that.
110%, mashallah. And I have to say one more thing about that. Here in the quarantine, I don't know about all of you, but we're entering into purple zone over here. And I'm sure, kind of thinking about another wave of quarantine and restrictions and such. But, I talked to a Stanford student recently in counseling, and I said, how's it going? And he said, I haven't left my apartment except for 3 times since the quarantine started. And I said, well, no wonder you're in counseling, inshallah, right? I mean, no, seriously, like in all seriousness, it was like, you can't do that. Like the subhanAllah, really guys, this concept of being holistic beings where body, mind, and soul are connected and important here. We didn't, this talk wasn't about Islamic psychology, but had I talked about that topic, you would have seen me present this model of Imam al-Ghazali actually, that puts the heart in the middle and connects to it the soul, right? The nafs, the ruh, the nafs, it took the ihsas or the emotions and the aql or the cognition, and it's all connected together. For us, it's very interdisciplinary, it's very holistic, and you can't ignore one thing at the sake of the other. And so therefore, this whole idea of exercising, absolutely, and it's not just to look good or to be fit, but actually it does have a very strong connection to your overall well-being, including your mental health. And I'm not going to say this to you unless I myself do this. I tell every single one of my patients and people I work with, you must exercise at least 3 times a week, if not more. And I'm not going to say that to you unless I do it myself, right? So subhanAllah, it's really important here. I could say so much more about that, but Allah, like, I'll tell you one more thing. Here's a hadith where there were 2 Sahabi, both of which I hope you recognize their names, but there's a Sahabi named Abu Darda. And he was very, he was really taken by this whole thing. And he said by Islam, about, spirituality and prayer and worship. And so he's saying this to his friend, another Sahabi named, Salman al-Farisi. Hopefully many of you recognize that name. And so he says to Salman al-Farisi, I'm going to dedicate my entire life to worship, right? Like very like zealous enthusiasm, right? And so Salman al-Farisi responds to him and says, إن لنفسك عليك حقا ولربك عليك حقا ولأهلك عليك حقا فأعطي كل ذي حق حقا. And so basically he says, your self, like yourself has a right upon you. Your body, Yani, has a right upon you. And your family has a right upon you. And your Lord has a right upon you. And you must give each their right. And then the story reaches the Prophet ﷺ, because the story takes place when they're just alone, but the story reaches the Prophet ﷺ, and when he heard the story, he said, Salman has spoken the truth. And that's how we have it in our hadith narration. And it's part of our hadith now, as the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. And that's really important when we talk about, you can't just stimulate mind all day long. I'm saying this because all of you mostly are students, and you can't just sort of stimulate body all day long either, and just, you know, focus on your carnal desires either, right? And you can't stimulate, and you also can't do spirituality all day long. There is a role for each, and each has to be given their right, and that is our Islamic understanding and our tradition. So body, soul, and spirit all have to be, you know, connected here, inshallah.
Inshallah. I have another question that I think we can all relate to some degree. Someone says they work for a grant called Zero Suicide, but I think the question is more general. It says, is there any advice to help me refocus and not experience burnout? I think burnout is something that we can all relate to. So what is your take on that?
So the question is about experiencing burnout specifically?
Burnout, yeah, and how to kind of not experience it, or maybe even recover from it if you are experiencing it.
Yeah, definitely. There are so many reasons for burnout, and there's so many root causes. And having, you know, when I think about burnout, and every time I've lectured or talked about this, I give the example of the iceberg. And if you look at the iceberg, what we call kind of the tip of the iceberg, you see very specific, you know, very limited things, right? And you're like, okay, maybe I'm burning out because, right? And you kind of list like a few things. But the reality is, when you look at the real roots of burnout, it's the rest of it is that huge iceberg underneath the surface of the water that you can't really see and isn't immediately visible, not just to you, but to even the people around you. And that's really important to think about here, of how, you know, why is it that you're burning out the way you're burning out? Probably it's because your bandwidth is stretched too taut, and you really need to be able to focus on and essentially cut off things that are causing that burnout if you can. And for some of you, I know somebody's going to say, can I cut out school, my finals? And it's like, well, you know, mashallah, in this period of life, this is what you're currently, you know, tasked with, mashallah. But there are other things, and maybe there are friendships, right? And maybe there are difficulties, and maybe there are people you cannot cut out of your life. Maybe they're family, right? And so in that respect, I would say this is where counseling would be very useful. Working with a counselor, a therapist would be very useful to figure out what are the priorities, what are the root causes for some of the issues. Maybe it's not something happening in the present and modern day. Maybe it's actually something historical from your childhood that's never been resolved altogether, right? And it continues to surface back up every so often and kind of trigger you again, causing you to have some of this anxiety and difficulties, and so on and so forth. So part of the protection against burnout is actually knowing what pushes your buttons, what makes you tick, and protecting yourself against those things, and potentially, you know, excising them out of your life, the things that you can, and the things that you can't, and you need help getting better and getting through them, is seeking out some support in order to do so. Right. So that's a whole lecture in itself, but I'll kind of suffice with that advice, inshallah.
Inshallah. Yeah. Another question here. Someone says, I have an addictive personality and find that I get obsessed with enjoyable things, you know, such as food, TV, social interactions, you name it. It starts as self-care, you know, watching one episode, or, you know, going to one event, or eating one, you know, this or that, but it ends up going too far, you know, harming my long-term mental health. How can I sustain self-care without going overboard?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And this is what I call the fallacy of self-care, because honestly, if you lend yourself to, you know, and this is part of the conversation from earlier about, like, you know, is mental health a Western construct? Well, not all of it. Like modern psychology, is it Western construct? And so now we have this whole discussion on our heritage and tradition, and we're careful, right, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But there are parts of it that are problematic, that don't fit well with our deen. And this whole bandwagon of, like, you know, you do you, right? That kind of catchphrase, or YOLO, right? Like, you're only gonna live once, right? You do your thing, and you do enjoy yourself. It's only one life, blah, blah, blah. The reality for the Muslim, this is not our tradition. And this is not the way we look at things. In fact, that whole discussion, which is a different one from today, of, you know, having akhirah vision, like understanding that there is a whole reality after this life here. And this is temporary and fleeting. So I won't get started on that line of thinking, because that'll take us another half hour, mashallah, to discuss. But what's important here is understanding that, you know, as you do some self-care, there has to be limitations. Like the hadith I mentioned just earlier, there has to be portions out, right? Where you are working in very much focusing on the akhirah, and very much focusing and being here in the present moment in the dunya, and bettering yourself and your reality. And when you need to take a break, and you should and have to take a break, of spending time with your loved ones, enjoying some and forms of entertainment that hopefully are healthy and not causing even more problems for you, okay, then you must do that as well. And then we talked about exercise a little while ago and physical health. But here's what I want to say to you. If you find yourself with somebody if you find yourself to be someone who's like an addictive personality, one of the best treatments for this, by the way, and this is a long discussion, but one of the best is do not lend yourself to addiction. And here I'm not just talking about substances. Here I'm talking about, let's talk about, you gave the example of your favorite show that you're watching, and one episode leads to another, and suddenly you've been up all night, right? and you have a midterm the next day, mashallah. That escapism that people do, especially students. No, but anyway, back to the Netflix thing. I tell people, right when you get to that point of like, oh, I think I'm hooked, what's the next episode going to be like? And of course it gives you that like 3 or 4 seconds, and it like automatically pushes you into the next episode. You're like, oh, I didn't do it, it just, the next episode just came, right? For you, of having the discipline to shut that down, right? And I always say this to people: if you get far enough into an episode, into a series that you start to really like, practice the self-discipline of doing cold turkey for a while. And if your nefs is literally craving it, like you can't wait to get back, maybe you watch every evening, so you can't wait to the next evening to get to the next episodes, right? Say to yourself, I'm not doing that today, nor tomorrow, nor the day after, until your nefs chills out, calms down. There's something so powerful in having power over your addictive personality. I'm not going to call it addiction, because some people truly have a real addiction, but this is more like lending itself to addiction. And so you cut it off. And it's so powerful to do this if you can. And sometimes, like, I'll get through an episode, I'll get to a certain part of a series, and I'll find myself really inclined and starting to feel that inclination. And I'll say, nope, no more for you. Right? And if it sounds like torture, it's not. It's actually called self-discipline. So you could do that with what you're watching. You could do that with what you're eating. You could do that with the people you keep company with. Like, be very careful of allowing yourself ever to become addicted or reliant on anything or anyone, inshallah. That's some advice there.
Jazakallah khair for that advice on, maintaining the proper balance of self-care and self-discipline. Definitely important. Another question, someone has said, physical touch is one of my love languages and is a way I self-care. With COVID, we aren't allowed to hug people when we meet them. Mm-hmm. How can I fulfill my love language without spreading COVID?
That's hard, mashallah. I hear you clearly. And, and I don't know if the person asking is asking and they live with other people like family members, or if they don't, especially if you're kind of alone, you literally are isolated away from your loved ones. It's even, of course, even harder. And so, mashallah, it's, you have to, I'll give you the advice of one of my teachers, where in lieu of, by the way, even if you're listening to this question, you're like, no, that's not me. I'm not really into hugs, or I don't even want hugs, right? What I'm going to say next applies to everybody, which is that basically, you can still do like a touch therapy, so to say, with nature and reality. Okay, before I even say that, the number of pets that have happened and like people have taken on pets in COVID is like astronomical. Our family did. We actually now have a COVID bunny, mashallah. But anyway, like that has helped, I think, for many people, having a pet. But nevertheless, the nature therapy, which is not really a real term. I'm sure actually maybe something out there is called nature therapy. And that's not what I'm referring to. What I'm referring to is something one of my spiritual teachers advised me, which is basically go out and break free of that virtual bubble that you're constantly in, especially during this quarantine and COVID era, and touch the leaves on the tree. And when she first said that, I was like, huh, what? Seriously? And she was dead serious. Like, you need to be able to rebalance yourself, right? Like kind of rebalance yourself with reality. And that includes, hugging the tree, touching the leaves, like being out into reality again, inshallah. So that should help and kind of give you some, it's not the same, it's not going to replace a hug. I mean, you can always hug a tree. And yes, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam embraced the weeping tree. So he might have been the first tree hugger that we know of, mashallah. But in reality here, you can find and be creative in other ways of how to fulfill that. But for everybody here, breaking through that virtual bubble that we've put ourselves in most recently is going to be really important. And I highly recommend it for all of us.
Jazakallah khair for that. Yeah, definitely can relate. Um, I think we have a last question here, and I think this will be a main takeaway for people. Someone has asked any words of advice for a family member or friend as to how to deal with a situation where their loved one is in a moment of need, of attention, and they're trying to deal with a certain situation. What advice would you give to a friend or a family member?
MashaAllah. And that was spoke to one of the slides, and thank you for the question. And that's one of the slides I spoke to earlier about how important it is to try to motivate the person. The first thing that I can tell you, and this is like so key, guys, one of the first rules I've learned in the field is you cannot make someone else change. As much as you want to, and as much as you love them, and as much as you just want to shake them and say, please, for me, do this, get help, etc. You cannot actually force someone to change or make them change. This is really hard, by the way. And instead, what you can do is actually inspire change in them. And sometimes that means you start doing this yourself. So let's say you have a sibling, that sibling's having a really tough time. You're trying to encourage them to get the kind of support and care they need, or maybe some other family member, and they're just not willing, they're just not wanting, they're just not willing. And so trying to break down that stigma and that internalized, no against actually getting help. And maybe if it's impeding on you, like the parent-child relationship, spousal relationship, anytime where there's a power dynamic in which that person, their lack of getting help is really affecting you and your well-being, then we say, you can control yourself, so you get the counseling and support and care. And then someone says, but I don't need it, it's them that needs the help. But as long as they're in your life, as long as they're affecting your life, you getting the support you need to know how to cope and deal with the person who is not actually getting the help they need and therefore affecting your life is so key here too. And sometimes when they see you taking that step and breaks down, breaks that ice and kind of breaks down the stigma, they might just get motivated to get that help too. So just a reminder of like how to do some of this, how to take some of these steps, inshallah. Maybe even say you'll go with them, or maybe sometimes it's just the process of taking the next step of like helping them finding them who those professionals are, helping them make, with their permission, of course, the appointment. Sometimes that's all that's needed. Going with them the first time, etc. There's all these ways to think about creatively, because if you just say you have to and you should and bad on you, it never works, guys. So be creative, inshallah. Think outside of the box a little bit. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give you all tawfiq and care and ability to, inshallah, get through these difficult times.
Ameen. Jazakallah khair for that answer. Yes, inspiring change in others by changing yourself and motivating, definitely central to our understanding. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Rania, for fielding all these questions. Before we wrap up the program, I just want to have a couple announcements. Let me move back to my slides here. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we have been co-sponsored by the IGA Mental Health Ambassadors, and they provided a few slides on some resources available to students at Texas A&M. I'll just talk about it briefly, but if you want to view these slides in greater detail about these resources, you can visit the link which will appear in the chat. But basically, student fees are funding, counseling and psychological services at Texas A&M. Many students are not aware, but these are resources that are free and available to them. The first step, of course, in anything is evaluation, and that can be easily done. For more information on this stuff, you can visit the Counseling and Psychological Services website, caps.tamu.edu. I also want to touch on some workshops that they offer, focused on teaching skills, how to deal with all these various topics. I also want to mention some other resources, and you can read more about these in the slides, the link which I sent in the chat just now, but I'll highlight, Helpline is a counseling service. Students actually, other students are trained and ready to answer calls if you need help, if you need to talk to someone. The number is on the back of your student ID card. I'll also highlight Sanvelo is an app, a mental health and well-being app. Students have a free premium subscription, and so those resources might also be beneficial. Lastly, These are some trainings that Texas A&M offers for students on how to deal with others who may be facing mental health challenges or may need help. So I encourage you, if you're a student at Texas A&M, to take advantage of these. Again, I put the link in the chat to these set of slides. You can refer to them for more information, inshallah. For those of you who have benefited from any ICPCS program this fall, including this one, we request that you fill out this education program survey so ICPCS can better serve you in programs next semester and beyond, inshallah. And with that, this evening's program comes to a close. I want to thank you first and foremost, Dr. Rania Awaad, for your time this evening, for enlightening, insightful, and inspirational presentation, and for fielding the many questions that we received. It's been a true privilege and an honor. I also want to thank all of you who attended and took time out this evening. I hope this program was beneficial for you, and I pray that this is only the beginning of our collective journey to better understand and care for our minds. جزاكم الله خيرا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.